An old photograph hit the table, and the entire room went silent. Naomi Eze stood frozen in her wedding dress, staring down at two strangers from another decade smiling back up at her. Beside her, Choi Hyun-Woo, the man everyone in that room feared, had gone completely still, his eyes locked on the same image. The Choi family filled the cafe around them, waiting for a wedding announcement that suddenly wasn't coming. Instead, Han Sok-jin, the lawyer who had spent months feeding them secrets one drop at a time,
Before the two of you decide whether this marriage is real, you need to know why your parents wanted you together.
across the room, Choi Eun-suk shot up from her seat so fast her chair scraped the floor, all the color draining from her face. That photograph should have been destroyed 25 years ago. Naomi looked at Hyun-Woo. Hyun-Woo looked at the photograph, a young Korean man and a young Nigerian woman on a Busan pier, decades before either of them had children who would one day stand exactly where they once stood. And somewhere beneath the golden light of that cafe, 90 days of forced marriage, stolen laughter, buried grief, and inherited love were finally about to make sense. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Naomi Eze ended up standing in that dress, you have to go back 3 months to a small, tired cafe tucked into a quiet Busan side street where the espresso machine coughed more than it worked, and the ceiling fan spun just slowly enough to remind everyone that better days had already come and gone. Naomi ran that cafe the way she ran her whole life, with her sleeves rolled up and her guard permanently raised. She had grown up in Nigeria under the roof of her aunt, Chidinma Eze, a woman who had crossed an ocean with nothing but grit and a recipe for resilience, and who eventually built this small cafe into something that felt, to Naomi, like the safest place on earth. When Chidinma died suddenly, without warning, without goodbye, Naomi inherited more than a business. She inherited the last physical proof that she had once been loved unconditionally. She was not going to let it disappear, even as the supplier threatened to cut off her coffee beans, even as the bank statement grew thinner by the week, even as she smiled at every customer while doing silent math behind her eyes. To Naomi, the cafe wasn't wood and steel and old furniture. It was her aunt's heartbeat, somehow still going. Across the city, in a glass tower that looked down on streets most people never dared to walk alone, Choi Hyun-Woo sat at the head of a boardroom table, and everyone in that room had learned, the hard way, not to speak until he did. At 38, Hyun-Woo controlled a private security and logistics empire that quietly touched half the port of Busan, and beneath its legal paperwork ran currents far more dangerous than shipping manifests. His father, Choi Sung-ho, had died only weeks earlier, and Hyun-Woo had not shed a single visible tear. When his right-hand man, Dae-won, asked if he was all right, Hyun-Woo answered without looking up from his papers. "My father left me an empire. He never left me a family." It was the kind of sentence a person says once, and then spends years pretending they didn't mean. Buried in his father's will was a property Hyun-Woo had never heard mentioned before. A small building in a quiet part of the city, currently operating as some struggling cafe. His plan was immediate and simple. Demolish it, redevelop it, build something worthy of the Choi name, something that finally erased whatever complicated softness his father had left behind. That plan met its first obstacle the moment Hyun-Woo walked into Naomi's cafe with 2 architects and a folder of legal documents, and calmly informed her that she had 30 days to vacate the premises. Naomi actually laughed, certain it was some kind of mistake, until she saw his face didn't move even slightly. "You have got to be joking." He wasn't. He offered her a settlement. She refused. He raised the number. She refused again, arms crossed, chin lifted, refusing to let a stranger in an expensive coat see how terrified she actually was of losing this place. "This isn't about the money," she told him. "This cafe is the only thing I have left of the person who raised me. You can't put a price on that, and I won't sell you a memory." Hyun-Woo, who was used to silence following him into every room, found himself staring at a woman who had just told him, essentially, to get out of her cafe, and meant it. He left. But something about her refusal followed him out the door in a way money never had. What followed was a small, stubborn war neither of them would openly call a war. Hyun-Woo sent inspectors to find code violations. Naomi made them pay for coffee before they were allowed to measure a single wall. He tried to restrict her deliveries through a technicality in the building's paperwork. She found a legal loophole of her own within 48 hours, using nothing but a library card and pure spite. He sent a lawyer to intimidate her with the threat of a lawsuit. She read every property document herself, line by line, until she understood her rights better than his own legal team. Dae-won began to notice something changing in his boss, a flicker of amusement hidden beneath the frustration, a reluctant respect creeping into every report about the cafe situation. The more Naomi refused to fear him, the more Hyun-Woo found himself unable to stop thinking about her. Then came the will. Han Sok-jin summoned them both to his office and read Choi Sung-ho's final instructions with the calm of a man who already knew exactly how much chaos his words were about to create. The building could not be sold, demolished, or redeveloped for 90 days. Naomi had inherited the cafe's operations. Hyun-Woo had inherited the building itself. And for those 90 days, under the specific written condition of the will, they were required to run the property together, or both of them would lose their inheritance entirely. There was a third clause, quieter and stranger than the rest. For the duration of the arrangement, they were to appear publicly as a united partnership, attending family functions and business events side by side, as though their sudden collision of lives was something planned rather than forced. Hyun-Woo's fury was immediate. Naomi's was louder, but neither of them could walk away from what they stood to lose. The arrangement became unavoidably real at a business gathering only days later, where an unfamiliar investor casually referred to Naomi as Hyun-Woo's wife. Naomi opened her mouth to correct him. Hyun-Woo, calculating the political cost of exposing the real terms of his father's will in a room full of powerful strangers, spoke first. "You're my wife now." Naomi nearly dropped the tray of drinks balanced in her hands. "Excuse me?" He didn't blink. For 90 days, she wanted to throw a coffee spoon at his head and told him so, quietly, through a smile so sharp it could cut glass. Dae-won, standing a few feet away, had to turn and pretend to check his phone so no one would see him fighting off a laugh. And just like that, without either of them choosing it, the fake marriage began. It was during their very first official appearance as a married couple that something happened at the cafe that neither of them would ever fully live down, and that would quietly become the emotional center of everything still to come. Hyun-Woo, determined to prove he was capable of contributing anything to the cafe he technically now co-owned, insisted on helping Naomi prepare drinks for the small gathering of guests she'd invited to soften the transition. Naomi warned him, twice, to follow her exact instructions. Hyun-Woo, a man used to giving orders rather than receiving them, nodded and then did precisely the opposite of everything she said. In the chaos of trying to look competent, he grabbed the wrong jar from the shelf, mistaking the label in the dim light, and stirred a generous spoonful of salt into a customer's coffee instead of sugar. The customer took one confident sip and instantly froze, his whole face folding in on itself in horror. Hyun-Woo, in full denial, immediately blamed the beans. Naomi, watching from across the counter, put the pieces together in half a second and burst out laughing so hard she had to grip the counter to stay upright. Hyun-Woo, offended on principle, snatched the cup back to prove there was nothing wrong with it, and took a long, confident sip in front of everyone. His face betrayed him completely. Naomi laughed even harder, tears actually forming at the corners of her eyes. And for the first time since his father's funeral, Hyun-Woo laughed too, not because the coffee was funny, but because her laughter had somehow made him forget, for one full, unguarded second, to be angry at the entire world. They would call it the salt coffee from that day forward, and neither of them yet understood how much weight that silly little mistake would eventually carry. In the weeks that followed, the cafe war quietly dissolved into something neither of them announced out loud. Hyun-Woo learned Naomi hated when customers rushed her, and started intercepting the impatient ones himself with a stare that ended arguments before they began. Naomi learned Hyun-Woo secretly loved sweet pastries, catching him one night after closing, elbow deep in a box of cinnamon rolls. He swore he was just inspecting for freshness. She started leaving one aside for him every evening after that, wrapped in a napkin near the register, and he started pretending he hadn't noticed, even as he ate it every single time. Enemies had become reluctant partners. Reluctant partners were quietly, dangerously becoming friends. Then Naomi found the photograph. It was tucked behind a loose panel in an old storage cabinet, half faded, showing a much younger Chidinma standing beside a young Korean man Naomi didn't recognize, both of them smiling like the whole world belonged to them. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written, Busan, 1989. The day we promised we'd never give up. Naomi turned it over twice, convinced she was misreading it. Her aunt had never once mentioned knowing anyone from a Korean family, let alone one wealthy enough to own half the port district. When she showed it to Hyun-Woo, his reaction told her this wasn't nothing. He stared at the photograph for a long, silent moment, because standing beside Chidinma, unmistakably, impossibly, was his own father. Han Sok-jin refused to explain, no matter how directly they asked. Your father left instructions, he told them, folding his hands with practiced patience. Some answers cannot simply be given to you. You have to find them yourselves. It was, Naomi realized, less a refusal than an invitation, and from that point forward the cafe stopped feeling only like a business and started feeling like the site of a decades-old mystery neither of them had asked to inherit. They found old letters hidden in the same cabinet, a rusted key with no visible lock, newspaper clippings with certain names cut out entirely, as if someone had once tried, imperfectly, to erase this story from ever being found. Choi Hyun-Suk arrived not long after, and her dislike of Naomi was immediate and unmistakable. She looked at Naomi the way a person looks at a stain they cannot quite remove, and warned her son with a voice sharpened by old fear rather than simple prejudice. Your father ruined himself once because of a woman. Don't make the same mistake. Hyun-Woo, who had never once heard this story, went very still. What woman? His mother's silence was louder than any answer could have been, and Hyun-Woo understood, with a cold certainty, that his own mother was hiding something that had shaped his entire life without his knowledge. That same night, long after the cafe had closed and the streetlights had taken over from the sun, Naomi found Hyun-Woo sitting alone at one of the small tables, still in his suit, staring at nothing. She asked, gently for once, why he never seemed to go home. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Home was never really home. Naomi didn't push. She didn't fill the silence with advice or sympathy he hadn't asked for. She simply pulled out the chair across from him and sat, saying nothing at all. For a man surrounded his entire life by people who wanted something from him, his money, his protection, his name, there was something almost disorienting about a woman who wanted nothing except to sit beside him in silence. It mattered more than either of them said out loud. Their worlds kept bleeding into each other after that. Naomi taught Hyun-Woo how to prepare a Nigerian-inspired dish from her aunt's recipe book, and he insisted with total confidence that he already knew what he was doing. He very much did not, and Naomi laughed until she nearly cried watching him attempt to season a pot like it had personally wronged him. In return, he taught her a quiet Korean tea ritual passed down through his family, his hands surprisingly careful and patient in a way his boardroom persona never allowed. Two cultures, two grief-shaped lives, slowly finding common language in the small, ordinary rituals of food and tea, and shared laughter over disasters in the kitchen. But peace never lasts long in a story like this one. A stranger began approaching Naomi outside the cafe, offering absurd sums of money for the property, refusing to explain who he represented, growing more insistent with every refusal she gave him. When Hyun-Woo discovered what had been happening, something cold and immediate moved behind his eyes, the instincts of a man used to solving threats with force, not conversation. He wanted names. He wanted the problem gone within the hour. Naomi stepped directly into his path before he could reach for his phone. I don't need you to destroy people for me. Then, quieter, more difficult to say than she expected, I need you to trust me enough to stand beside me. It was such a small sentence, and it rearranged something fundamental in how Hyun-Woo understood protection. Maybe love wasn't about controlling every danger around a person. Maybe it was about standing next to them while they faced it themselves. Not long after, while searching the storage room for the source of the mysterious key, they found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, containing a single, unlabeled cassette tape. They played it that night, alone, the old cafe radio crackling to life around a voice neither of them had heard before but Hyun-Woo recognized instantly. His father's voice filled the room, worn and tired and finally honest. If you're hearing this, then we failed to tell you the truth while we were alive. What followed left them both frozen in place. Choi Sung-ho and Naomi Eze had been deeply, completely in love decades before either of them existed, planning a life together that powerful family pressure had violently torn apart. Neither of them had ever stopped loving the other, not for one single day, not through marriages arranged for reputation, not through decades of silence and distance and duty. Then why did your father marry your mother? Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hyun-Woo had no answer. For the first time in his life, the foundation of his family, the wealth, the reputation, the carefully constructed image of the Choi legacy began to look less like strength and more like an elaborate performance built over a broken promise. The fake marriage, meanwhile, had stopped feeling fake days ago, even if neither of them had said so out loud. At family gatherings, Hyun-Woo's hand found the small of Naomi's back before he consciously decided to put it there. Naomi noticed the exact moment his jaw tightened under pressure and would step in with a joke sharp enough to redirect the room's attention before anyone else caught it. They finished each other's sentences without meaning to. When someone at a dinner casually asked how long they had actually been together, they both opened their mouths to answer and then, for the first time, found themselves without a ready lie, because the truth had quietly become more complicated than the story they were supposed to be telling. One evening, closing the cafe together, Naomi made him coffee exactly the way he liked it now she'd learned. Eventually, without either of them announcing the moment it happened, and then, smiling, deliberately stirred in the smallest pinch of salt before handing it over. Hyun-Woo took a sip, raised an eyebrow, and looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You're still punishing me for that day?" Naomi shrugged, entirely too pleased with herself. "I'm making sure you never forget." He smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way to his eyes. And the old joke that had started as an embarrassing accident had quietly transformed into something closer to a love language only the two of them understood. Of course, nothing this fragile survives without one final storm before the calm. Hyun-Woo discovered, through one of his own men, that Naomi had been quietly digging through Choi family records, the same records tied to shipping routes, land deals, and legal disputes his organization depended on staying private. His deepest fear, the one he had spent his entire adult life defending against, came roaring back all at once. That anyone who got close to him eventually wanted something from what he controlled. He confronted her without warning, accusations sharp in every word, certain she had used their arrangement, used their friendship, used everything between them to get closer to his family's secrets and, by extension, his inheritance. Naomi stood there, stunned, watching the man who had just weeks ago sat beside her in silence, now looking at her like a stranger who might be dangerous. "You were the first person who taught me that trust could be dangerous," she said, and walked out before he could see exactly how much that accusation had cost her. She found the truth alone, days later, in a letter tucked inside Chidinma's old journal, the ink slightly faded but the handwriting unmistakable. Chidinma and Sung-ho had designed the entire inheritance arrangement themselves, decades in advance, knowing their families would likely never cross paths naturally. The 90-day condition hadn't been some accidental legal clause. It had been engineered carefully, deliberately, to force their children into the same room, the same building, the same forced proximity that had once given the two of them their only stolen years of happiness. But there was something deeper hidden in the letter's final lines. They hadn't simply wanted Naomi and Hyun-Woo to meet. They had wanted Hyun-Woo to face the very choice his father never had the courage to make, back when it might have changed everything. The full truth arrived shortly after, and it was worse and sadder than either of them had expected. Choi Sung-ho hadn't walked away from Chidinma by choice. Hyun-Woo's own grandfather had threatened to destroy Chidinma's entire family, her business, her reputation, everything she had if his son didn't end things and marry within the family's approved circle. Sung-ho surrendered not out of weakness, but out of love, choosing to protect her from a distance rather than lose her to ruin. He remained in the Choi family for the rest of his life, wealthy and respected and quietly hollow, carrying a regret he never once spoke aloud until a hidden tape recording gave him a voice from beyond his own death. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing you more powerful stories like this. With the 90 days nearly finished, Hyun-Woo stood at the edge of the exact decision his father had once failed to make. His business partners pressured him to finalize the redevelopment immediately, reminding him that sentiment had never built an empire. His associates warned him that showing emotion, especially over a woman, especially now, would make him look weak in front of men who were always waiting for weakness to exploit. His mother reminded him, again and again, not to repeat his father's mistake, never once realizing she was describing the exact opposite of what Hyun-Woo now understood his father's real mistake to have been. Sung-ho's mistake wasn't loving Chidma. It was letting fear convince him that love had to be surrendered in order to survive. Hyun-Woo made his choice standing in the same cafe where the war between them had first begun. He rejected the redevelopment deal entirely, restructuring the property so the cafe would remain exactly where it stood, transformed instead into the center of a small community project that honored both what his father had lost and what Naomi had spent her whole life protecting. It cost him. His associates questioned his judgment. His reputation within certain circles took a hit that would follow him for years. For the first time in his life, Hyun-Woo chose something that could not be purchased, controlled, or negotiated. He chose it simply because it was right, and because losing it would have cost him something far more valuable than money. He confronted his mother next, refusing to accept silence as an answer any longer. Choi Hyun-Suk finally broke, her carefully composed face cracking under decades of buried guilt. "Your father loved her aunt until the day he died," she admitted, and Hyun-Woo felt something in his chest fracture and settle at the exact same time. "Then why did everyone lie?" he asked. His mother's answer arrived quiet and honest, stripped of all its usual armor. "Because we were afraid of what love would cost us." The words landed harder than she probably intended, because Hyun-Woo recognized, instantly and painfully, that he had spent his entire adult life making the exact same mistake his parents had made, choosing fear disguised as control over love disguised as risk. He found Naomi at the cafe that same night, standing behind the counter she had nearly lost twice now, once to him and once to his own fear. He didn't bring money, he didn't bring power. He didn't bring a single argument prepared to win her back. He simply told her the truth. "I spent my whole life believing love was something people used against you." He paused, searching for words that didn't come easily to a man who had built his entire identity around never needing anyone. "You came into my life and somehow made me afraid of losing something I never knew I wanted." Then he did something that surprised her more than anything else he had ever done. He told her she was free to walk away, free to choose whatever she wanted, without condition, without contract, without a single string attached. For the first time in their entire complicated, forced, accidental relationship, Hyun-Woo gave her a real choice instead of trying to control the outcome. And that, more than any apology, was what finally convinced her he had actually changed. Naomi didn't answer him that night. She needed time, and he respected that in a way the old Hyun-Woo never would have. Days passed in careful, uncertain quiet, both of them circling the cafe like two people afraid to disturb something fragile. Then, one afternoon, she returned. She placed 2 cups of coffee on the counter between them, one for herself, one for him, the way she used to before everything had gotten so complicated. She slid his cup toward him and waited. Hyun-Woo looked at it with visible suspicion, one eyebrow raised. "Salt?" Naomi shook her head slowly, a small, genuine smile breaking across her face. "No, I finally learned what you actually like." He took a sip. It was perfect, rich, warm, exactly right, made by someone who had clearly been paying far closer attention than either of them had admitted out loud. He smiled at her, the real smile, the one that had first appeared the day a stranger's ruined coffee had made her laugh so hard she nearly cried. "I like the first one better," he said. Naomi blinked, confused. "The one with the salt in it?" He nodded slowly, holding her gaze. "Because you were laughing." The silly, embarrassing mistake that had once nearly ruined a customer's morning had quietly become the most honest symbol of everything they had built between them. Proof that love didn't need to be perfect to be real. It only needed to be true. What followed was not another forced arrangement, not another legal condition, not another performance for a room full of watching relatives. Naomi and Hyun-Woo chose, freely and completely on their own terms, to marry for real. No inheritance clause required it. No contract demanded it. No family expectations shaped a single decision. The wedding took place exactly where their story had actually begun, inside the same small cafe that had once been a battlefield between a stubborn cafe owner and a feared mafia boss, and had slowly, quietly, become the place where two guarded people finally learned how to be safe with each other. It was at that very wedding that Han Sok-jin handed them one final envelope, the last piece of a story that had taken 3 generations to complete. Inside was a letter written jointly, in 2 different handwritings, by Naomi Eze and Choi Hyun-Woo, composed years before either of them died, hidden away for the exact moment their children might finally be ready to read it. They explained, gently, that they had never truly expected their children's paths to mirror their own so closely. They had simply hoped quietly, desperately, across decades of separation, that if fate ever gave Naomi and Hyun-Woo the same impossible choice, they would find the courage neither Chidinma nor Sung-ho had been allowed to have. The letter didn't just explain a mystery. It finally released 2 people from a grief they had carried without even knowing its true shape. Several years passed, and the small, struggling cafe that had once been on the verge of closing forever had transformed into a thriving Nigerian-Korean cultural space, filled every morning with the mingled scent of Busan pastries and Lagos spices, the sound of 2 languages weaving comfortably around each other. Naomi still ran the business with the same stubborn fire that had once made a powerful, feared man back away from her counter in confusion. Hyun-Woo had changed the way his entire organization operated, using his influence now to protect the people around him rather than simply control them. No longer known only as a ruthless mafia boss, but respected as a man who had learned the hard way what real strength actually looked like. Naomi still teased him relentlessly. Hyun-Woo still, to this day, insisted he didn't really like sweet pastries, even as he reached for one every single evening without fail. Their family grew slowly around the cafe's warm wooden walls, filling the same space where an old photograph had once revealed a secret 25 years in the making. That same photograph still hung on the cafe wall, a young Chidinma Eze and a young Choi Sung-ho, standing together on a Busan pier, sunlight caught forever in their eyes. Beside it now hung a newer photograph, taken on the day of a wedding that finally happened for the right reasons. Naomi Eze and Choi Hyun-Woo, standing exactly where 2 generations before them had once stood, finishing a love story that fear had once tried to erase completely. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, property, or power. Sometimes it is simply the opportunity to correct the mistake the generation before you was too afraid to fix. Hyun-Woo began this story believing love made people weak, something to be controlled, negotiated, or avoided entirely. He ended it understanding something far more difficult and far more true, that love, real love, chosen freely and without condition, was the first thing that had ever truly made him brave. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves meaningful stories. We'll see you in our next unforgettable journey.